John here from Great Lakes Country with another canning video. You know, it occurred to me recently that I've made videos about canning applesauce, and not too long ago I made a video about making pumpkin butter. But I'd never actually made one about canning or making apple butter. And so that's what this video is all about. We're gonna be taking a big old pile of some beautiful fresh apples, processing them down, adding some other ingredients, and making the most rich, thick, luxurious, spreadable apple butter. When we're done, we'll can it all up into some lovely pint jars, just like this. And if you're not really familiar with apple butter or what it's used for, it's sort of like if you made applesauce, but cooked it and reduced it until it was much thicker, a lot deeper and darker, making for the perfect sort of spreadable sweet condiment, I guess. Think of it like a jam or a peanut butter. Just another flavor in that sort of category of things. My favorite way to use it is to spread it on a delicious homemade biscuit and with a little bit of butter on there too. But apple butter also makes for an amazing glaze on pork, such as ham or pork loin. In any case, it's a pretty easy thing to make. Just takes a little while to let it simmer for a couple hours, and you can whip up a big old batch of this stuff for yourself. So let's get right into it and start making this apple butter. All right, and here are all the apples that we're gonna be using today for this apple butter. And what I've got here is just a little over 8 pounds of Fuji apples. And all of these apples are kind of on the small side, so that means I need a whole bunch of them. In this particular case, there's 27 apples that we're gonna be using. And the first thing I need to do is peel and core them. And there's a couple different ways I could go about doing this. I could just get to it with a little hand peeler, or I could even blanch them and sort of peel the skins off of here. But I'm gonna show you how I like to peel, as well as cut these apples up with a very handy little tool that makes extremely quick work out of this process. This here is my manual crank-operated Victorio apple peeler, and it works quite well at peeling a whole bunch of apples, regardless of their size. All I need to do is press the apple onto these little spikes here and start cranking. And I'll mention that this device also has this optional blade attachment, which is going to actually spiral slice the apple as it peels. If I needed just a peeled apple, well, I wouldn't use it, but I need to break these apples down to turn them into my apple butter. So it's going to save me yet another step by just letting it slice these up as we go. So I'll just start cranking away, and as it reaches that blade, it's gonna start slicing them into this long spiral. And I end up with a whole bunch of apple mess, which is what I need to end up with anyway. And sometimes when the apples are particularly small, it doesn't necessarily slice all of the bits off of the outside. So yeah, some of these I'm gonna have to still come in with a knife to make sure I get all that extra apple flesh so I don't let anything go to waste. And in the meantime, I've got a big stock pot filled about halfway up with water. And to it, I'm gonna throw in just a squirt of some lemon juice. And as I get those apples cut up, I'll just throw them into this lightly lemon juicy water, which is gonna keep those pieces of apple from turning brown before we're ready to actually move on to the next step. As for the peels and the cores, well, do whatever you want with that. Throw it in the composter, save it to dehydrate and do something else with. But when we're ready for the next apple, we just slide the little axle back, put a new apple on the spikes. I'll mention this thing has a suction cup, which holds pretty well to a smooth counter, but doesn't hold permanently to this wooden cutting board. So I'll just make do as best I can. And I'll just repeat for 27 apples till I've got them all peeled and spiraled up and thrown into that pot of lemony water. That was a way better example than the first one that I did. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And from here, I'll just slice the whole thing down the middle. And we've got a bunch of beautiful half slices ready for the pot. And if you want to check out this apple peeling machine for yourself, consider buying one. They're not really expensive. Check out the video description below and I'll put a link to this exact one that I'm using. All right, now we can finally start processing these apples down into our apple butter. So I've got all of that water strained out of these, and the apple pieces are back into this big stock pot. And to that, I'm going to add 4 cups of apple cider. Now you could certainly just use water instead, but I really like the extra flavor that using apple cider brings to it. And this time of year, you can find the stuff everywhere and pretty cheap. So now we just gotta get this big pot on the stove, and because it's a pretty nice day out, I figure we might as well do the cooking steps outdoors. So I've got my Camp Chef outdoor stove fired up, and I'm just gonna get this whole pot heating up on, I'd say, medium-high heat. And I'll let these apple pieces cook away for a little while until they've become very softened. And I'll stir them pretty regularly every few minutes just to make sure everything's got some good heat, nothing's risking burning or scalding onto the bottom of the pot. You know the drill. So when those apple pieces are very soft, we're gonna go ahead and stir in all of our remaining ingredients, which are 4 teaspoons of cinnamon, a half teaspoon of cloves, a half teaspoon of allspice, a half cup of lemon juice, and a whole lot of sugar. 3 cups of white sugar and 3 cups of brown sugar. And now just get that all stirred in until everything's completely incorporated. And I'll mention that this recipe is based very heavily on the ball canning recipe for apple butter. But I've actually reduced the amount of sugar that recipe calls for by 2 entire cups. For a batch this size, the ball recipe would say to use 8 cups. I don't want to reduce that too much because the sugar content does play a part in the shelf stability aspect of this canning recipe. But 8 cups of sugar for this batch seems pretty heavy, so I've dialed that back just a little bit. Anyway, I'll let everything in this pot come back up to a low simmer. Just let it simmer away for a few minutes before it's time to blend everything. And with a batch of stuff like this, I love to use an immersion blender because I don't have to take everything out of the pot and load it into a countertop blender. I can just put this immersion blender right into the pot, give it hell for a couple minutes until everything's absolutely pureed and completely homogeneous. But if you don't have an immersion blender, you can certainly carefully transfer all of it in batches into a standard countertop blender and puree it that way. Now once everything is blended up as much as it can be and it's back in the pot, if you did have to use a countertop blender, we're going to bring everything back up to a simmer once again and let it simmer away for a few hours. Because apple butter is supposed to be thick and we need this to reduce and thicken up quite a bit. And I'll mention that I like to put one of these mesh screen things over top of the pot. One, because as it starts to thicken up, it's gonna be spattering quite a bit. And this screen is going to prevent a ton of that from making its way onto my stove and ceiling and kitchen. Though, if you're cooking outdoors, this isn't as big of a deal, but I also just don't wanna lose a bunch of that apple butter to spattering. And second, because I am cooking this outdoors and it's a pretty warm day outside despite being fall, this is gonna help keep any curious bees or other bugs out of there during this long simmer. Okay, so our apple butter concoction has been simmering away for just about 3 hours, and we're getting pretty close. So I've got my big hot water bath canner set up on the burner next to it, filled with water, and I've got my pint jars in there so they can get nice and sanitized so they're ready to fill just as soon as this apple butter is ready. When this mixture is reduced and thickened enough to where I can basically pile it up on a spoon without it just running and seeping right off, we've reached our desired thickness. So now we can move this operation back inside and start doing the actual canning process. So I will carefully drain that hot water out of each of these pint jars and get them moved into the kitchen on a towel on the cutting board. Now we just need to start filling these up. So using my little canning funnel, I'll just start ladling it in. We just need to fill these jars up almost to the top, but we do want to leave 1/4 inch of headspace. And this batch of apple butter got us almost exactly 4 pints. There is a little bit left in the pot, and we may need a little bit of that when we start the next step, which is to measure that headspace. Pretty much just eyeball it with the ladle, and then I need to come back in and make sure that I've got the right headspace with my little measuring tool. Basically, the first notch right here rested on the edge of the glass, and we should have the tip of it just barely touching the food. And I knew as soon as I did this that I was gonna need a little bit more in basically all 4 of these jars. So I'll just spoon a little extra in and fine tune it a little bit with this spoon. Okay, that's looking pretty good to me. And by the way, the smell coming off of this apple butter is just amazing. It's just made my entire kitchen, if not front yard, smell just absolutely delicious. And yeah, I may or may not have tasted a little sample, and no surprise there, it also tastes great. Anyway, the next step is to debubble. So using the other end of that little measuring tool, I'm just gonna get into each jar, give it a very gentle stir, kind of scrape along the inside of the jar walls, just trying to knock loose any little stubborn air bubbles that might still be in there. You don't have to get too crazy with this step. Just give it a little bit of attention on each one. Try not to make a huge mess, which is certainly something I have a problem with from time to time, which is why our next step is so important, and that's wiping the rims. I pretty much lack the ability to fill mason jars up without getting the food all over the top edge of the jar, sometimes all over the outside of the jar too. So we need to very carefully and thoroughly wipe each of the jar rims with a damp paper towel to make sure there's absolutely no food residue left on that little edge. And the reason for that is if we leave anything that can obstruct a good seal from that jar lid, well, we might have a failed seal. This all works because the rubber gasket on the lid is pressed firmly against a clean, smooth top edge of the glass. So just use as many damp paper towels as you need until you can wipe it and not see any of that apple butter left on your paper towel. I gotta tell you, on this camera monitor, this stuff is coming out almost black in color, and it is certainly a very dark, rich brown, but it's definitely not black like it's coming across on this video. I think I was canning up jars of Guinness or something by the looks of it, but I assure you, it is the exact color that you'd want it to be. Okay, now we are finally ready to put on the lids, and I've had my lids simmering in this little pan of water for a couple of minutes. And I'll mention that the manufacturer used to recommend boiling the lids to sanitize them for the longest time. But in more recent times, they've actually recommended against doing this, as it could potentially damage the rubber gasket. They still say that you can simmer them, and so that's what I do. And all I gotta do is set each lid right on the jar, make sure it's pretty centered, and that's it. And since that simmering water is pretty hot, I got my little magnetic lid picker-upper tool, which definitely comes in handy. If you want to see the basic canning toolkit that I use in pretty much every one of my videos, a lot of people ask about it. I'll put a link to it in the video description in case you want to take a look. And of course, now for the metal rings. We're just gonna screw each one on, tighten it a little bit just until it's snug. They call it finger tight. We don't need to crank it down with all our strength. Just make sure it's snug and it's not gonna go anywhere. Now, these jars are ready to can. So we're moving back outside and we're gonna get these into the canner. But there is a quick step that I like to do first, and that's to use my little infrared thermometer to take a quick temperature check of the water in that canner as well as the outside of the jars themselves. The water in the canner's still pretty hot because I was using it to sanitize those jars. The jars are pretty hot because they were sanitized in that water and also have piping hot apple butter in them now. So I just want to make sure that the temperatures between that canner water and the jars themselves are pretty close. And that practically ensures that there's no risk of glass breakage. If the water in the canner was way colder or way warmer than the jars themselves, that opens us up to the possibility of cracked glass. It's not super common unless your temperatures are vastly different, like a really, really cold jar, plunging it into really hot water. But I will say that in all the years that I've been doing this little temperature check, I haven't had a single jar break. It's looking like my jars are reading in at about 150 degrees and the canner water is about 170 degrees. That's close enough for me. I generally like to see that temperature no more than about 20 degrees apart. And if the canner water was too cold, I could just heat it up a little bit with the stove. If it was too hot, well, I can throw in some ice cubes or some cold water, just lower the temperature a little bit. But this right here is looking pretty good to me. I'll do my best not to have the jars touching each other or the outside walls of the canner, and I definitely have at least 1 inch of water above the top of those jars, which is what I need. So heats up at full blast, putting the lid on, and we need to let this whole thing come up to a full rolling boil. Once it hits that full boil, our processing time has begun, and this recipe needs 15 minutes of processing. And of course, you may need to adjust that if you live at a high altitude. So we'll jump ahead to then when the processing is finished. All right, processing is done. The heat's off, the lid's removed, and I'll just let these jars sit in that water for about 5 more minutes before pulling them out of there. At which time, I'll carefully remove them with my jar grabber tool and transfer them back into the kitchen and set them on a towel on the cutting board. Now, I just need to leave them alone for several hours until they've completely cooled down to room temperature. And over the next little while, I'll start to hear the lids pop. That is, being pulled down inward and tight to the jar, thereby signaling a sealed jar and a successful canning. As always, if any of these jars didn't seal, well, I could put a new lid on it, try processing it again, but on the rare chance that that happens, I generally just take that jar, put it in the fridge, and make sure to use it first. As for all of these here, they all sealed successfully, so once they're cooled down, I can remove the rings, put them up in the pantry, and have lots of amazing homemade apple butter to enjoy whenever I want. So there you have it, 4 pints of perfect 100% homemade apple butter. And I know it takes a lot of apples to make, but if you're a fan of apples or applesauce or apple pie, well, I think you're really gonna wanna try this stuff if you haven't had it before. Anyway, as always, I'll put a link in the video description below to the full written out recipe if you wanna try making this for yourself. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future canning, food preservation, and cooking videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.